Hi, everybody, and welcome to Conversations on the Culture. I'm Kim Kennedy, the moderator of this next broadcast we're doing, Zoomcast, I should say. And we're so glad that you're joining us. We are going to be welcoming both Alex Newman and Chris Wright to our Zoomcast today. Have a very interesting and timely subject that needs to be discussed. And I'm going to start with Alex first. And Alex is an award-winning international journalist, educator, author, and consultant, in addition to serving as president of the small media and information consulting firm Liberty Sentinel Media. He's written for a wide variety of publications in the United States and abroad. He currently serves as a contributor to WND. I read that, I like that. Freedom Project, the New American Magazine, Crisis Magazine, the Law Enforcement Intelligence Brief, and also numerous magazines and newspapers such as Gainesville Sun, Liberty Magazine, the Diplomat Magazine, Swiss News, Sunshine State News, Campus Reform, Alachua County Today, and many more. His work has been featured at Drudge, Breitbart, Fox News, and many other outlets, and his writing has been published in major newspapers across America. Alex, I know that you're also an author of some books. Would you like to tell our subscribers, our members, a little bit about that as well?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, Kim. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And yeah, most of my time I spend writing articles for the New American Magazine. I'm the foreign correspondent there, and so I do a lot of traveling and writing. And when I can, I like to write books. My most recent book that I co-authored was actually about Obama, and people think, well, that's kind of passé. Didn't the Obama era end? Well, no, actually, we argue that it's just as relevant now as it was during his administration. And I wrote that with Trevor Loudon and Cliff Kincaid and Joel Gilbert and a lot of America's who I consider to be the best investigative journalists in America. Just great people. That book is Comrade Obama Unmasked, Marxist Mole in the White House. And my biggest contribution to that book was actually the section on South Africa and Obama's ties to South Africa. So that's fun that's going to be our conversation today. If people want to go in much more detail about Obama's links to Nelson Mandela, the South African communists, and what's happening there, they can get a copy of that book. It's on Amazon and everywhere else. Before that, I co-wrote World Federalism 101 with Rick Biondi, who actually proudly describes himself as a globalist. And he was very involved with a lot of these globalist organizations before he realized, wait a minute, the kind of globalism they want is basically planetary slavery for everyone, whereas the kind of globalism I want is planetary liberty for everyone. So he kind of split ways with them there. And then maybe the most important book that I worked on, I co-wrote, was with Dr. Sam Blumenfeld. He wrote 12 books on education, 13 books on education over his lifetime. The one we did together was published by WND Books, called Crimes of the Educators, How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. And that is basically a large expose of what's happening in the so-called public school system, which I think is more accurately described as a government indoctrination system. And what we argue is that if we don't get a handle on this, our liberties are done, cooked, finished, at least over the long term, right? It might not happen tomorrow, but they've got several generations now brainwashed and dumbed down. Give it a few more, and it's all over. So we argue that this is an existential threat to our country and our freedom.
Well, Alex, we have many conversations to have, but we want to stay focused on the topic at hand and have you come back in the future and discuss what you just mentioned there. I would suggest to you before we move forward that Obama is busier now than probably when he was president. Do you disagree with that?
Absolutely. Actually, it's funny we're talking about South Africa. He was just down there, dancing and celebrating Cyril Ramaphosa and how he was such an inspiration for his country, right as the president of South Africa was blabbering about how he was going to start stealing land without compensation. And we're now in the radical second phase of our communist revolution. He was down there praising the wife of a mass murdering communist butcher, the communist dictator of Mozambique. And just incredible stuff. And the U.S. media was really missing in action on this. If they did report this Obama trip to South Africa, this was for the centenary anniversary of Mandela's birthday, they really missed the point. And we reported it right as it was happening. And then a few days later, Tucker Carlson jumped on it as well. But other than that, you almost didn't hear a word about the significance of this.
there was some videos making the rounds of white people, a white man in particular, being killed in the street, beaten to death, kicked to
Hmm.
death. And I heard maybe from one or two other news outlets, but otherwise, oh well, which is alarming because there are those who would say that that couldn't happen anywhere else. And I would ask, why not? Um, and what would you say to that idea? Could that happen here in America? Could that happen elsewhere?
Well, I would argue, and I hope we can end on this as well, so that after we talk about this, people will see the significance. I would argue, and I'm certainly not the first to argue, that the Afrikaner nation in South Africa, it's often been called the canary in the coal mine for Western Christian civilization. So this was a nation very much like our own. This was a Christian people from Western Europe who set out to unexplored parts of the world, who were searching for freedom, for being away from the quarrels and the monarchies and the oppression of Europe. And we actually have more in common with the Afrikaner people, who are mostly descended from Dutch and German Lutherans and French Huguenots and some Scandinavians who went down there starting in the 16th century. We have more in common with that nation, with the Afrikaner nation, than any other nation in the world, even more than with the British. In fact, that they fought British imperialists, and so did we, right? They lost because they had their women and children put into concentration camps. We won because we had strong forces and a good general, and the French joined us, so we had some advantages. And so what I would say is, not only can those things happen in the United States, in Western Europe, those things will begin to happen in Western Europe if we don't get a handle on this. Because what's happening is exactly what happened to the Afrikaner nation, right? They were disenfranchised. They lost complete control over their own destiny when they voted to surrender power in 1992. That exact same trend is happening in the world. Now, we as Americans are being told, Europeans are being told, Australians are being told, no, this whole idea of a self-governing country, that's passé. We're now in this era of globalization. Now the UN is going to be the representative. The G77 plus China, which is actually 134 governments. They said the UN General Assembly should be considered an emblem of global sovereignty. You had the head of the United Nations, until just recently, Ban Ki-moon, running around the world calling the United Nations the Parliament of Humanity. Well, what do you think is going to happen to America, or to the Netherlands, or to Australia, or to Japan, if every dictator in the world gets to vote on our destiny and gets to vote on what's going to happen to our property? Well, we're going to lose our freedom, and we're going to lose our prosperity, obviously. And so exactly what happened to the Afrikaner nation in South Africa, they were subsumed into this mass of democracy involving 12 or 15 nations. If that were to happen at the global level, we were to move toward a global governing type system, which is very much in the cards. I mean, these people talk about it openly. We would lose control of our own destiny. We would lose our own freedoms. And I think the type of violence that you're seeing in South Africa could very easily take place here or anywhere else.
All right, well, let's go back to the beginning. And you're telling us that this has been going on for a very long time, and that it sounds like what you've described for me so far is that there's no interest in coexisting, as the bumper sticker exhorts us we should all just get along. I'm not hearing that from you. And Gregory Stanton, you say, sounded the alarm going back to the early 2000s. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, Gregory Stanton is the guy who really convinced me that I needed to jump on this, because I actually moved to South Africa in, it must have been 2004, on the day of my 18th birthday. I had earned some money as a child, and I thought, well, I don't want to live with my parents anymore. I think I'll buy a plane ticket to South Africa and go see how that works out. So I did, and it was nice. And, it was very clear that it was a troubled society, but having grown up in the third world, it was just kind of normal for me. I didn't think too much of it. Yeah, of course, police are corrupt. Everywhere police are corrupt. But, the racial tensions and stuff was something I hadn't really experienced so much before, but it hadn't blown up yet, and I still, I had been raised with the same mythology as everybody else. Oh, well, Nelson Mandela was some kind of freedom fighter. I had never heard he was a leader in the Communist Party, that he had bombed women and children, that his wife had been a huge endorser and promoter of necklacing, maybe the most barbaric form of execution known to man, that his wife had been convicted of murdering a child and torturing a child. I didn't know any of those things. All I knew was what everybody else knew. So when South Africans started contacting me and say, hey, things are going bad here. This is not good. It doesn't look like this is going to end well. I thought, well, that's maybe just not serious. But then when Gregory Stanton went down there, he went on a and for those who don't know, Gregory Stanton is the head of Genocide Watch. He's probably the world's leading expert on genocide. And by coincidence, he was also an activist against the apartheid system. The apartheid system being, the system that existed in South Africa from about 1948 all the way to about 1992, when whites down there, the Afrikaners and the descendants of the Brits, voted to surrender political power. Essentially, it meant separate development, right? There was, you might think of it as the Indian reservation system in the United States. When Europeans arrived, they weren't going to have a democracy with Cherokees and people who, scalp you and, worship ancestors and things. So you guys live over there, we'll be over here, and that'll be fine. But it ended up being very complicated. A lot of, terrible things happened under that system. And I think everybody pretty much acknowledged that system had to go. But, the question was, do we need to hand over the country to communist terrorists? Well, that's a whole nother question, and we can have that discussion. I think there was plenty of other alternatives that didn't involve handing the country to communist terrorists. So Gregory Stanton, I know I'm kind of getting off track, but you kind of have to do that with a big subject that people don't know much about. And I know people don't know much about it because I grew up with South Africans and I didn't know much about it. So Gregory Stanton went down there on a fact-finding mission in 2012. As the head of Genocide Watch, to look at what was happening. There was vicious hate crimes. I mean, hate crimes beyond what I think an American can imagine, because we just don't have that kind of thing in the United States. The rape of babies with broken glass bottles, pouring boiling oil down the throat of a child, boiling kids alive, drilling holes into women with electric drills, just, torture more barbaric than anything you can imagine, happening primarily to Afrikaner farmers, to Boer farmers. And he went down there to investigate because he was hearing the same reports that other people were hearing. And I encourage everybody to go see the report that he produced, the press conference that he gave. What he said was, this is a country that is barreling toward genocide. There's not a genocide yet. He had developed an 8 stages of genocide through his organization. He had studied all these different genocides, and he actually predicted many of the worst genocides that have happened in our lifetime. And he had developed this ranking system. And he put South Africa at stage 6 out of 8, which was the planning and preparation phase. Stage 7 was the actual extermination, where they go around and kill people. And then stage 8 being denial after the fact. So when this guy, who had been an anti-apartheid activist, who was the world's most credible, most recognized authority on genocide, went down there and said, hey, this country is on the verge of genocide. You have the president singing songs advocating the extermination of minority groups. And you can watch them on YouTube. You can see Jacob Zuma singing, bring me my machine gun, kill the Boer, we're all going to kill the Boer, my cabinet, we're going to shoot them, and they're going to cry, and just, barbaric stuff. Any country in the world except South Africa, if you had a president singing about exterminating minority groups, it would be headline news all over the world. And yet in South Africa, nobody was paying attention. So when Gregory Stanton came back and said, this is what's happening, I said, this is real, this is serious, I need to do something. And so I put together a cover story. Actually, I have it not with me. I wish I could have shown it to you guys. But we put together a cover story in the New American Magazine saying that genocide and communism threaten South Africa. And unfortunately, I hate to say I told you so, but we're now, 6.5 years later. And unfortunately, that's exactly where this is all heading. And if something doesn't change, if South Africa continues on this course, it is going to end in absolute tragedy. I think Zimbabwe even will look mild by comparison.
Well, that's pretty dire. That's very foreboding, and we should all be aware of it. We should be talking about this more. We should be raising major concerns. Is the UN doing anything? Is there any discussion going on? Yeah. Okay.
No, the UN is the most disgraced group of dictators in the world. They love mass murder. You have the Human Rights Council that is literally dominated by mass murdering communist dictators. So of course they're very happy with. It's funny, they have this whole little clique. The Castro regime actually sent troops down to help the African National Congress, which now rules South Africa in a partnership with the South African Communist Party, to overthrow the apartheid government, along with the Soviet Union, the Communist Chinese, the North Koreans, the Vietnamese. So they're all one big happy club. They love to diss the United States and Israel, right? Their two favorite targets for being alleged serial human rights abusers. But the Afrikaners can expect not one iota of assistance from the United Nations. It's not going to happen.
Well, as you're talking, I'm thinking of a movie I saw, Hotel Rwanda, several years back, and the Hutsis and the Tutus, or I can't remember the names. The reason I bring that up is because as you're speaking, I'm wondering, is all discrimination white on black, or is there black on black discrimination, genocide arising too as well? Or in South Africa's case, is it just the Afrikaners and the black majority?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because on the surface, it looks like this is a racial thing. It looks like the black majority government, the regime there, has it out for, in particular, the Afrikaner minority. I mean, descendants of the Brits will probably end up slaughtered in the process as well. But they really have it out for the Afrikaners, for the Boers. But when you look behind the surface, I don't really think that it even is so much about race. And again, on the surface, it looks like it's all about race. But I think the real goal here is to implement a communist dictatorship in South Africa. And I think that's been the goal all along. It so happens that the Afrikaners, they still have a significant amount of wealth. I mean, before they voted to surrender political power, South Africa was essentially a first world nation. The world's first heart transplant was done by an Afrikaner doctor. They had nuclear power. They had nuclear weapons. I mean, this was an advanced country. Their life expectancy was the length of an average European. It was a first world modern country. And so they accumulated wealth. They own farms. They own factories. They own, banks and assets. And so at some point they want to take this all. And so, the communist theorists, they have different theories, and they say that the liberation struggles are different in every country. And in South Africa, that's true as well. So they divided the communist revolution up into two phases. The first phase was, we'll be nice to you guys. Actually, Ramaphosa, the current president of South Africa, he was quoted in an autobiography of somebody who helped draft the South African Constitution, as saying that we're going to boil them alive like a frog, right? We'll do it nice and slow. So first it was all about reconciliation. Oh, we're not going to slaughter you guys. We're not going to take your stuff. We promise that if you guys let us take over the government, you can keep your property rights and you can keep your language and your culture and your religion and all the rest. Well, now we're in the radical second phase, is what they call this part of the revolution. And this is the part where they come out and steal everything. And so, the communists always need a scapegoat, right? They always need somebody to hate. And, even George Orwell understood this, the 2 minutes of hate we all hate on Emmanuel Goldstein, right? They always need a target to hate to be able to carry out their plan. And so I think that's what's going on there. Plenty of other minorities will get caught in the crossfire. I think a lot of people don't realize about South Africa. It's really not one nation. It's many nations. You have the Zulu people, for example, one of the powerful, prominent nations in South Africa. You have the Xhosa nation that Nelson Mandela came from. And some of these still retain their own sovereignty. In Lesotho, the Soto people still maintain their own sovereignty. In Swaziland, the Swazi people still have their sovereignty. In Botswana, the Tswana people maintain their independence. But within what's called today South Africa, this rainbow nation, there are many nations, so-called. And as long as they can cobble together 51% to stay in power perpetually through quote-unquote democratic elections, they'll scapegoat anybody, right? The Khoisan is another group in the Western Cape that I suspect is going to become targeted as well. Because they identify traditionally more with the Afrikaner people than they do with the Bantu tribes that live further east in South Africa. Many of them speak the Afrikaans language as their mother tongue. They've intermarried with the descendants of the Dutch, and so they're much more aligned with the Afrikaner than they are with the Bantu people. And I think they will end up suffering big time if something doesn't change again. And there are independence movements now where the Khoisan people, the colored people as they're called, and it's different than colored in America, back in the 1950s. Colored is more the Khoisan people, the descendants of the Malay, the South Asian people, are kind of allied now with the Afrikaners in trying to resist this genocidal communistic takeover of South Africa. So other people will get caught in the crossfire for sure.
Do you see these people leaving the country or having a will to fight it out and form a separate army, a military? what is the response?
Yeah, it's actually a little bit of all those things. And, the Afrikaners, I'm fascinated by their history, and they have a tendency of never being united when they need to be united. Now's the time when they really need to be united. But unfortunately, they're a lot like Americans. They're stubborn, they're independent minded, and, I'll do what I want to do. You go do your thing. So some of them are preparing to defend themselves. Some of them are working on plans to declare independence, and there's actually several different independence movements going on right now. Some of them want to get the old Boer republics back, the Transvaal and the Free State. Others think the Western Cape and part of the Northern Cape, maybe the whole Northern Cape, and even a little bit of the Eastern Cape ought to secede and become its own country. There actually was already an effort to do that, led by a self-appointed king of the Khoisan, who were the original inhabitants of the Western Cape region of South Africa, allied with some of the Afrikaner factions. Plenty of them have already left. I would estimate that about 1/4 of the population of Afrikaners has already left South Africa. The ones who could, who weren't, tied down by family, or some of them now are so poor they couldn't leave if they wanted to. They can't afford an airplane ticket, much less all the paperwork and documents and all that. Plus, no country will take them. Right? Australia has now started saying, we're going to expedite refugee visas for South African farmers. But, America isn't interested. Canada just a couple of days ago declined the asylum request for some Afrikaner farmer family. And so, all different things. A lot of them, I think, would like to leave. Some of them will not leave under any circumstances. They've said, hey, this farm has been in my family for 16 generations, and I'll be darned if somebody's going to take it from me. And, unfortunately, I think those people are going to be in for a world of hurt. And, from my personal perspective, from what I can see so far, I think the option of having the Western Cape secede is probably the best option at this point, because they're Afrikaners, with their allies, the Afrikaans-speaking Khoisan and others, still make up a significant majority of the population, and they could secede, I think, very easily from the rest of the country. So that's probably the best idea as far as I can tell.
And, Alex, after, I'm thinking of Cambodia and Vietnam and other countries, after they have these great purges, they're left destitute. They're left, and I'm reading that's what's beginning to happen in South Africa. And I've read about that in another Western African nation. I cannot remember the name of it, where they are now asking the farmers to come back because these farms have been in their families for generations. And nobody knows how to run them. These people understand how to run them, and they work them, and the property that they've stolen, and they now want to give to someone. These people have no clue. They don't know what they're doing, and the very people that they say they wanted to help, they've ended up hurting the most. I kind of liken it to when you had the big riots in Baltimore and some of these inner cities in Missouri. I forget the name of that town, when they burned half the inner city, some of the worst.
Ferguson. Mm-hmm.
You burn down the Rite Aid, you burn down all these businesses, they won't rebuild. And who pays the price? The people who live in those inner cities. The ones who were already hurting are hurting even more. And are you seeing that in South Africa?
That's exactly what's going on, Kim. And, I think Zimbabwe offers a sneak preview of what's coming to South Africa. Zimbabwe used to be Rhodesia, and actually it was an incredibly prosperous country. It was a Western Christian nation, and as we think of it, it was a non-racial system. Voting qualifications were not based on race at all. It was, are you educated? Do you own property? Can you read? Because they didn't want just somebody who just came out of the bush and had been, hunting zebras to survive to come and have, a full-fledged vote. But they had a very interesting system where the tribal chieftains had some power, where anybody was allowed to vote if they met the criteria. And unfortunately, elements within our government, the United Nations, basically sold out the Rhodesians and insisted. Jimmy Carter actually was a crucial player in the sellout of Rhodesia. They handed it deliberately. They actually had elections, and a good guy won the first time around. A good Christian leader had won the original election, a black man. And Jimmy Carter and company were not happy with that. They insisted that this maniac, Robert Mugabe, had to take over, and he did. And one of the first things he did was he went and genocided the Ndebele people in Matabeleland, the fellow black people who apparently their tribe didn't get along with Mugabe's tribe. And so as soon as he took power, he went and slaughtered tens of thousands of them, maybe 80,000, who knows? Nobody talks about that. Some years later, he decided, well, you know what? All these white farmers, I don't like them. I want to give all their land to my cronies. And, if I just give it to my cronies, then they'll be rich. And of course, everybody knows what happened next. They chased them out. Many of them were murdered and brutally tortured. Their families were tortured, killed. And he gave the land to his cronies. And of course, the farms went back to the bush. They went back to the wild. They don't grow anything. And, Rhodesia used to be known as the breadbasket of Africa. They exported food and agricultural commodities all over the world. And after they gave it over to the communist terrorists, of course, it turned into an absolute disaster, right? They were begging the United Nations and the United States for food aid just to survive. And the exact same thing is now happening in South Africa. Only I think it's going to be worse in South Africa, if that's possible to imagine, because it's such a violent society. I mean, their murder rates are off the charts. Rape is a fact of life there for everybody. And it's a cauldron waiting to explode in everybody's faces. And I suspect if they go through with this land confiscation and keep upping the genocide rhetoric and the genocide songs, they're going to end up starving to death, just like the people in Zimbabwe did.
Just unbelievable. We talk about this on a very consistent basis, just the destructive nature of communism. There's nothing good or redeeming. It's like a harsh windswept rain that comes through and pulls every leaf off the tree, uproots all the plants in the trees and leaves nothing of value in its path. And it's just a burden for me, and I know Chris shares this too, to see it extolled by the younger generation, to hear you speak, and there's no redeeming value to Marxism, communism whatsoever, non-socialism, whatever name you want to put on it, none whatsoever. There's nothing good, nothing productive, nothing good that comes out of this system of government. Never has. I'm sure it sounds like at some point in the future we could talk about the history of Marxism and what, if anything, it has accomplished, Alex. And so I'm glad that you have articulated these gruesome stories, and they're difficult to hear. They sure are, but we need to hear them. We need to learn from history, and so that's not repeated. You say that the fate of South Africa's Afrikaner minority could be a preview of what's coming to all of Western Christian civilization if globalists and communists are allowed to continue moving their agenda forward. How does that affect other people in the world, including America?
Well, to me, it looks very much like what is happening to South Africa is kind of the test run for what they intend to do to broader Western Christian civilization. And by that, I mean, societies that have as their foundation kind of Judeo-Christian values that respect private property rights. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, right? So you respect property, you respect life. The family as the foundation for this. We're rapidly moving away from that. And unfortunately, there are very, very powerful elements in our country, in Washington, D.C., in New York, in Brussels, in Paris, in London, that are totally in favor of this. And they want to move the world toward this vision. If you can listen to them, you can go on YouTube and you can hear George H.W. Bush talking about it. You can hear Bill Clinton talking about it. They describe it as a new world order where the UN is going to implement its vision. And, again, you can hear George H.W. Bush speaking publicly about this on national television. He said, we're going to build a new world order where a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role, which by that he means its military forces, to bring about the vision of the UN's founders. Well, we know who the UN's founders were. We had, mass murdering communist maniac Joseph Stalin on one side, and then on the other side of the table representing us, you had a guy called Alger Hiss. And, Stalin loved the guy. Hey, why don't you sit as the first Secretary General of the UN? You can run the conference that creates the United Nations. And, of course, a few years later, he was convicted as a Soviet spy. So we know why the United Nations looks like it does. And we know what they mean when they talk about a world run by the United Nations. It is a world where our liberties are not safe. Our ability to govern ourselves will be completely wiped out. And where we will move toward a system of totalitarian control. And once we lose the ability to maintain our own sovereignty, and, until Donald Trump came along, this was a steady process. Obama actually accelerated it more than any other, but the sellout of American sovereignty had been going on for decades, for generations, a little piece at a time. They never wanted to do anything too big to alarm people. But once we lose our sovereignty, we lose the ability to defend our rights. It's a totally different view. Our founder said, God gave us rights and we institute governments to protect these rights. The view of the United Nations and the governments that make up the United Nations is the exact opposite. Government will give you some privileges, and if we decide you don't deserve those privileges or we want to take them away from you, we will, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that is the world that we're heading toward right now. And they'll say this is global democracy, right? They'll say, well, look, every government has a vote in the General Assembly, and every government voted that it's only fair because you evil Americans and your carbon emissions were responsible for global warming, that now you need to pay us all restitution, and you need to give us some of your money and all of your technology, and you guys can't be running around with guns. That's crazy. What are you guys thinking? And that's the world we're heading towards. And there's a fantastic book written by a guy who's actually become a good friend of mine now over the years. I think probably the most astute analysis of what's happened in South Africa, and probably the best book on South African history that I've ever come across. It's called Amabulu, The Birth and Death of the Second America. And he makes the case that basically South Africa is just the sneak preview of what's coming to the United States and all of Western Christian civilization if we don't get this sorted out. And he actually, he said Obama is like the epitome of this, the embodiment of this, a guy who just literally hates Western civilization, who hates this idea of limited government and God-given rights and constitutional restraints on government authority. And, that's why they have the borders wide open. That's why during the Obama administration, they were picking up everybody they could find in the Congo, in Syria, in Iraq, and flying them into the United States in the middle of the night with no passports and saying, oh, you guys are refugees, come have free houses and free healthcare. This is crazy, but it's all part of the agenda. And if we don't wake up, we're going to end up in the same situation that our cousins in South Africa are in right now.
Alex, you have spelled it out so well, and my heart is pretty overwhelmed right now. And my personal beliefs are that this is a call for my fellow Americans. This is a turn back to God moment. So much of our Christian Judeo roots have been put aside, and the country is suffering in so many ways as a result of it. And, God is merciful, and I would exhort all those listening to go back to the Bible. And I have a feeling you would second that and agree with that.
Absolutely.
And to be the influence, as you're talking, I'm thinking of Dr. Livingstone, an African.
Dr. Livingstone, I presume, yeah.
Yes. And the great missionaries that went into the world back in the day and were a force for greatness. And it would be wonderful to see that happen again. And I don't know God's timetable, but it certainly does help us to know how to pray. And it's just helpful that way. Your heart is broken for those who have suffered so. Much of this information is new to me because there's so much news that isn't told. If you watch the local news or even a lot of the national news, half of it is Hollywood talk. It's for those who enjoy that type of thing. So this has been very helpful. I know that you and Chris wanted to talk about the breakdown of the rule of law and how this all ties in together. And so I'm going to let you take the last portion of the conversation and share with us what you wanted to talk about to wrap it up.
Kim, you waiting for me?
Yeah, sure. Chris, you go first. And if Alex wants to jump in.
All right. Well, there's a couple of clear differences between American constitutionalism and the New World Order and the socialism that Alex was describing. The first is individualism versus collectivism. We have a tradition in this country of individualism, and that's how you get a tradition of strong individual rights. You can't have that individual rights tradition without first having a philosophical undergirding that elevates the individual. In contrast, the socialistic systems are all about collectivism. The group rights come first. Another clear difference is that, as Alex mentioned, we have a tradition here of limited government. Well, in a socialistic system, or what appears to be, if you get to break down the rule of law, as appears what to be happening in South Africa, then you'll get a system of unlimited government. And that's a problem because people don't operate well and governments don't operate well without limits. So the way I like to put it is that limited government never killed 100 million people, but communism has. We have as a result of all that, we have a a strong tradition in this country of property rights. And if I can speak just for a moment to contrast what's happening in South Africa versus what we have here in the United States by virtue of our Constitution. We have the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees the right to property, and we have the power of eminent domain is also contained in that Fifth Amendment, but there are limits. And the takings clause says that private property shall not be taken for public use without paying just compensation. As I understand the proposal in South Africa, the idea is to take the farms without paying just compensation. Now, what I've heard is that there actually has not been a change to the Constitution so far, and some people made a big deal about how legislation to accomplish this was withdrawn, but my understanding is that the legislation was withdrawn only so that the constitutional process, the process of amending the Constitution, could move forward. So they are talking about taking private property without paying just compensation, and that contrasts very clearly with what we have here in the United States, and I'll let Alex pick it up from here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you, Chris. And the interesting thing about South Africa is that the communists actually deceived the people to get their agenda through. They said, "Oh, we'll respect your private property rights. Look, we'll even put a clause in the Constitution that says your property may never be taken without just compensation." And that's what the Constitution continues to say to this day. You have a Cyril Ramaphosa who says, well, that doesn't really mean that. We can still take property without compensation if we do it legally and if we say it's in the public interest. So they're already skirting the Constitution. They've got plans to actually amend. Cyril Ramaphosa said, even though we can already do it, we still want to amend the Constitution just to make it more legal and proper. And so I would say to Americans, be warned, there's nothing in our American DNA that says these types of things can't happen here. If we are not willing to enforce what's written in the Constitution becomes meaningless. If we don't know what's written in the Constitution becomes meaningless, and the government does essentially whatever it wants. And so we need to fight to make sure that the Constitution is enforced, is not perverted, and is not distorted. And if we're not willing to defend those things, we could lose them, which is exactly what's happened to other people around the world and exactly what subversive elements in the United States are hoping will happen here. That's why they're teaching the kids in the schools, the Constitution is actually just this outdated, old, dumb living document, and we can just reinterpret it for modern times. So they're teaching the children all kinds of nonsense. And if we as parents, as adults, as educators, as people in the media, don't do our best to inform other people about the values and why they're so important that are enshrined in our Constitution, we will lose it over time. And so, Chris, I appreciate so much what you're saying, and I hope that everybody will go out and say, we need to value this, and we need to work hard to make sure that we keep this, because if we don't, the alternative is disaster.
And Chris and Alex, Conversations on the Culture was founded to not just be another place to come and talk. There's talk abounding, but to do liberty. And I'm listening to you speak, and one of the first things I'm thinking of, property taxes are designed to make people not landowners, but to be renters from the government. And it sounds like that's in violation of our Constitution. So we need citizens to stand up and go to their elected representatives and say, this taxation violates the Constitution, violates the Bill of Rights. And citizens need to, what we encourage people, and I'd love to hear both of your feedback, but it's going to take the people taking their personal liberties seriously and getting involved in the process, because it's not in the best interest of those in Washington, D.C. and where I'm at in Pennsylvania and Harrisburg to do the will of the people, because they live a very comfortable lifestyle. They live better than most of the rest of the country, and they would have no interest in restoring liberties and limiting their own powers. Would you both speak to that?
Well, let me start by saying I don't have an action item for South Africa. Perhaps Alex does, but I can tell you that in my own activities on my personal website, liberato.us, L-I-B as in boy, E-R-A-T as in Tom O, liberato.us, I have something on there called Champions of the Constitution Grassroots Network. We push back whenever we see the Constitution being attacked or being slighted in some way. So, for example, earlier this year, when former Justice John Paul Stevens wrote in the New York Times that we ought to do away with the Second Amendment, we pushed back on that, and we're in 9 states currently. Alex?
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Kim. And I would say, education is going to be hugely important in this battle. There is massive ignorance in the United States today by design. The government schools have orchestrated this on purpose. And God's word speaks to this. If you go to Hosea, is it 4:6 or 6:4? My people are destroyed for the lack of knowledge. If we don't understand our heritage, if we don't understand our Constitution, if we don't understand the principles of liberty, it will be very easy for us to lose those things. So we all, as individuals, need to take responsibility to make sure that our communities are educated. We like to complain about Congress, and we should. They're doing awful things, but who is voting these people into office? Well, it's our uneducated neighbors who don't understand the Constitution, who don't understand liberty, who don't understand the problems with unlimited government. So we have a responsibility to go and educate them. And I would say, if you want one great tool to help start with that, get a subscription to the New American Magazine. We'll keep you informed on all the important news of the day that the fake news media is not talking about. And you'll get information about the Constitution, what it means, how to implement it, action ideas. And, again, it's our responsibility. Nobody's going to go do this if we don't. And so, each of us as individuals needs to go out and work on this. And, the stakes are really high. It's easy to think, well, somebody else will do that, or it's not even a big deal. It's just a small infringement on liberty. But look at the big picture and look at what happens if we lose this incredible experiment in liberty that we've been fortunate enough to have just been born with. We don't want to squander that.
I could not agree with you more. And we are doing our part here. Conversations for the Culture was born out of that, to not only talk, but to educate and equip people to change. The thing is, Alex and Chris, and I know you can speak to this more than I can with the few minutes we have left, but when you look at our own revolution and great movements throughout history, seldom are they the majority. Is that true? So when you get some people who are fired up about liberty, and they would agree with Patrick Henry that give me liberty or give me death, there's no alternative, that because people like that had that attitude over 200 years ago, we're sitting here with the freedom to have that conversation, but it is not hyperbole to say that those liberties are under fire. So we will continue to talk about them and seek solutions. Alex, I hope you will come back, and there's so much to be discussed, to talk. Chris, I know you will, as we explore these, but also teach people, equip people to do liberty, how to work in a representative government and be a force for good. I'm going to put you on the hook and say, will you do that both in the near future?
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much, Kim. Really appreciate it. I'd be delighted to come back on. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to Chris and Tyler, too.
Thank you so much, guys. Tough subject, but we want to get the truth out there. So thank you again, Chris. We'll talk with you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim.
Thanks, guys.